The beginning of the end is here. This is one of the last 2 patches of set 14 Cyber City, and then we're going to be off to whatever set 15 holds for TFT. So if you're struggling on a new patch and you want to desperately hit that rank before the season end, I spent the entire weekend watching a bunch of tournaments and talking to the world champ himself, and I'm pretty sure we have the best tier list available to help you climb. So let's take a look at TFT Academy and find out what's on top and how do we play it. Let's talk about the most important lines from the patch notes so that way you know how to adjust your gameplay. Loot systems once again changed, and this is some of the biggest stuff that can ever happen to a TFT patch because this will affect your game-to-game about how many resources you get and what can really affect your game plan. Players have been complaining that they feel like they're item poor, so even if they hit their board, they aren't able to itemize them, so they actually increase the number of item counts from PvE, but as a trade-off, they actually reduce the average gold count from PvE as well. What this means is pragmatically, number one, we should be thinking about taking more econ again. Taking econ augments is going to be really important to make sure that we keep up our goal count, and also because chances are you're going to end up being contested a lot in this meta. Point number 2, frontline is insane this patch. They buffed 7 Exotech to now give 300 HP per item equipped. They also buffed 6 Vanguard to now give 48% shield, and all this is just so much HP stat. And so now, Frontline is going to be stat checking you every single game. If you're playing a composition that can't deal with 6 Vanguard and a bunch of Exotech HP and just thick Frontline in general, your composition sucks. And this is why Econ is really important because now it's more important than ever to make sure that if you're playing around things like a 4-cost carry, that you upgrade it. Because if you're stuck on a 4-cost 1-star, how on earth are you going to ever get past 48% shield on 6 Vanguards and they're all upgraded and, you know, heaven forbid they have combat augments to help them stay alive longer? It's just a ton to deal with. And so make sure that you have a good amount of damage baked into your kit, either through items or your upgrades or your augments to deal with all this amazing frontline. Point number 3, Garen. Garen is so much stronger this patch. They buffed him to now be only 80 mana out of 100, so that means he's going to generate damage that much faster every time he's able to cast. Not only that, they also buffed a ton of verticals, and Garen ends up being really good in vertical compositions because he just gives you more additional activations of that trait onto your board. And so because we're in the vertical meta, Garen ends up being an insane cap. He's basically around the same tier as Zac now, where if you get Garen enough mods and snowball your board, he will let you win the game. Macro broad view of the tier list as well is that right now, I would say that AD is on top. You want to be thinking about AD every single game, and you want to specifically look if you can play around Exotech or Marksman Vanguard and slam items like Ginsu's Rageblade because it's really powerful for the AD lines in general. So I'd say priority number 1, think about whether or not you can play Exotech or Marksman Vanguard and some of these AD lines. Point number 2 is I think AP this patch feels pretty bad. I would say that the only viable AP lines that you can play right now are Strategist A.M.P and Dynamo. And these don't feel very good because they are fast 9 compositions. They're not really a composition you want to play on level 8. And this is largely because Vex feels a lot worse as a carry right now, and Street Demons is also just kind of a meme unless you have like the stars align type of game. And so because AP is much worse right now, instead, I'd recommend that you go for Reroll as your secondary game plan alongside the AD lines. If you have an opportunity to play around Twisted Fate and Leblanc, you still have opportunities to play this entire X tier and maybe even some of the niche lines like Vayne. You should be able to Reroll as a backup out if you don't have anything else. Oh, also don't forget about the Gorilla. Interestingly enough, the best AP lines tend to be rerolls, so if you do end up getting AP items, either force your way into the AD, like if you have a tier, try to make a frontline item. If you have a rod, make Rageblade Gunblade, or try to find your way into some of these reroll lines. The best comp in the game currently is Exotech Zeri. We've come full circle. They buffed Exotech again, and now it is the best vertical in the game. They buffed it from 240 to 300 HP per component. So if you get like a random extra tier, bow, belt, so on and so forth, you just put on like Jax, for example, and you get 13 attack speed and 300 HP, which is kind of like some of those cybernetic bulk augments. Very, very powerful. And this composition is pretty stable just on 1-star. So even if you hit 1-star Zeri, 1-star Sejuani in a roll down, you should be pretty stable as long as you have good Zeri items. Good Zeri items in general is Rageblade plus Kraken's Fury. That's 2 bows, a rod, and a cloak. And you're going to be wanting to build them pretty much with every combination of Zeri. If you don't have Pulse Stabilizer or Flux Capacitor, you could just go for a third item like Gunblade or anything else that makes sense, Deathblade, Giant Slayer, so on and so forth. But you should try to play Exotech if you have a Zeri item and one of the good defensive ones. I would say that the only permutation of Exotech that I'm not excited about is if it's Hollow Bow plus 2 defensive like Lantern and Coil. Another thing to pay attention to is that even though we have items on Varus, I'm pretty sure Jin 2 is also quite solid and can do as much as Varus and can even be a great complementary AD carry to Zeri. And that ends up being really important because let's say you're in a scenario where you slam Rageblade and you have Infinity Edge because you're thinking about Vanguard Marksman and you find a good excuse to play Zeri and Sejuani for Exotech. You can actually just give Jin what should have been Xayah items. So, Infinity Edge and Striker's Flail and all those extra AD items, Jin can hold that and it's perfectly fine. What really caps Exotech the highest is if you can get Garen with an Exotech mod onto him and start putting him as an AD melee carry. Garen got buffed a lot this patch. His ban wave is now 20 fewer mana, and so Garen just casts a lot more often, does way more damage. If you have Hyperfangs, get the Exotech emblem or mod onto him. In the late stages of the game, it's ideal to actually give him the mod even if you have the emblem, so that way you can get a third extra item like Infinity Edge or Hand of Justice or whatever else you want to put on him to make Garen really shine. And then you just realize that you have way too much stats and you can just cap the board really high. Exotech is also going to be a composition that you play out of Cypher a lot if you have the items for it. So if you are looking for another composition to play out of Cypher outside the usual stuff that we talk about, try to play some Exotech. A couple other things worth mentioning. Flicker Blade is the best artifact by far in this composition. It is unreal on Zeri. It's basically the old Rage Blade, but way better, and it gives her the scalability of damage. The fact that each attack also gives 4 AD and AP is really important because Exotech pretty much has everything except damage. So anything that can give damage to the Zeri is going to be really, really impactful. The other thing is that the best Radiant item is Torrential Maelstrom. This one is an insane Radiant item on Zeri. So if you're upgrading one specific item on her, try to go for the Radiant Kraken. Other augments that are worth noting, of course, everyone knows that by now in the set, Trade Tracker is really good in Exotech as well as some free items. But I want to give a shout out to Sponging. Sponging is really good in Exotech in particular because you get all these free items that you can spread across. So, for example, you can put 1 Vow on Sejuani and 1 Warmogs on Mordekaiser. And then what you do is you wait for the fight to start. Sejuani and Mordekaiser give each other the items. So the Vow would go on Mordekaiser, the Warmogs would go on Sejuani because Sponging says, up to 6 champions with 1 fewer item get a copy. And then after they get that item, you slam the Exotech item and complete 3 items on them. So you just basically bench your Exotech items every single round, wait for the Sponging to activate, then give the third Exotech item so that way you get 3 items on your tank. And voila, you avoided the awkward point of Sponging, which is you usually have only 2 items on some late game units or tanks. There's a lot of small ticks and trips about this composition that really make it shine. And we haven't even touched about like some of the late game potential of it as well. Like, Aurora could be really good to pull in more other units, or you can play Zac, or you can just find a way to cap really high with the other 5 costs. If you don't have the Exotech emblem, just play Neferi. It's not that big of a deal, but you do cap a little bit lower. It's just one of those things where if you get the Exotech emblem, it ends up being really, really nice. AMP is still an S tier for us, but that's only if you're able to play it uncontested, and that's pretty rare in ranked lobbies at the moment. You usually have 1 or 2 people trying to play for it, so it's hard to get Annie 2 pretty uncontested. These days, Golden Ox is also really popular. Graves is still really strong and popular in the meta, so it's going to be harder to get things like Annie 2 and the Nico 2 online. But uncontested AMP is extremely powerful and still caps really high once you get the Zac rolling with a bunch of blobs. A couple things have changed about this composition. One, a lot more people are playing it from Win Streak now because it's pretty much the only AP comp that you really want to play for outside of Dynamo. So because there's so few AP comps like we talked about at the beginning of the video, in general, it feels like you can just slam tempo AP and then pivot into the strategist line a lot less contested. There's just fewer people trying to hold your units. So a lot of people end up just playing level 8, level 9 straight up, not trying to lose streak and open fort, and just try to get to the board just naturally. When you get to level 8, a lot of people don't know what to do if they don't hit Samira and they don't hit the 5 costs. You want to roll for other units like another Bruiser with your Mundo. You play Mundo before you hit Samira because you need frontline. So you play like Mundo and you play Gragas, or you play Mundo and you play Alistar with Annie. Anything that just helps you get cheap frontline, because that's what ends up being the big limiting factor in this competition. You end up making so many backline items that you can't really prioritize to make frontline items. So you need to have something in the front to buffer for it. Otherwise, Annie and Yuumi won't have time to get their casts off. And you really want Viego because Viego is just good with the Golden Nox to link with Annie, and he ends up just doing a ton of damage in the late game. So he's a much better cap than Kabuko and Ziggs, which is a really common end game that a lot of people angle for. Outside of that, just pretty much the usual AMP shenanigans. Just really strong when you can get to it with a bunch of econ. You still can play loose streak AMP. It's totally fine. It's actually a really common scenario if you have AP opener and you don't have a good, strong win streak position. Just open for it. Try to go for econ and AMP. So you can still stick to your normal game plan if you want. At the top of A tier, we have 6 Vanguard Marksman. This is a newer variation of Marksman Vanguard. In the past, we had 4 Marksman in the front, 4 Vanguards in the back. But because they buffed 6 Vanguard and the shield is just outrageous, now people are just playing 6 Vanguard and tying in 2 Marksman in the back. The nice thing about this is that even though it's simple, you actually have a lot of versatile options for replacements because Leona is the most contested forward cost in the game. She's going to be really hard to hit across all these comps. And so if you don't find Leona 2, what do? You probably just tank any of the other 2-star Vanguards for quite some time. And it's pretty serviceable until, probably about midway of stage 5. That also goes for the backline as well. A lot of people might not hit Aphelios 2, Xayah 2. You can totally play Jhin 2, Jinx 2 until you find Aphelios and Xayah. So don't feel like you have to stay on level 8 rolling for Aphelios 1, Xayah 1 the entire time, feeling like you're stuck. You can just play Jhin 2, Jinx 2, hold, the Aphelios 1, Xayah 1 on the bench if you don't have anything better. Or even just duo carry, right? Let's say you do hit Xayah 2, but Aphelios 1. Don't play that Aphelios, play that Jinx 2 instead, and just have like a duo carry scenario. So there's a little bit of versatility there, which is really good. The second element of what makes this comp really strong is that Garen is insane because, once again, they buff Garen, and he's really powerful with these Vanguard setups. The best Garen mods is Vanguard on Garen, but also Golden Ox is really powerful. If you can get Golden Ox as a damage amp mod onto Xayah, that ends up being one of your other win cons. And then a couple of other things are pretty solid. Like you could do Anima Squad Aphelios. It's never bad, although it's not that great. And you can also Vanguard the backline if you really need. You also do have a flex slot if you do have a Vanguard emblem on 9. If you have a Vanguard on Garen, you could just play also an Aurora. You could play a Zac. You could justify a Renekton splash as well. There's a lot of different small things you can do. You might be wondering, is it worth going for 6 Vanguard and 4 Marksman? The answer is yes, but you sort of need to have one emblem of each in order to make it fit cleanly. Otherwise, you're not going to get it till level 9 or 10, which is a little bit too late. And it's hard to say it's good because if you make it to 10 anyways, chances are you're doing really well in the game. So you probably could have done a bunch of different things to succeed. Vanguard emblem itself is something that I think you might feel like you can take early, but the thing about Vanguard emblem is that it's not that strong unless you can win streak with it and stay ahead. If you're like taking Vanguard +1, but you have like 1-star Vanguards and you have no actual upgrades to play around, it's not that good. And that also applies to the Vanguard Circlet that might give you a Leona the belt. So just keep that in mind. And then the other thing too is that when you play 4/4 Marksman Vanguard, we were much more flexible with backline items. Like you could kind of slam any kind of sort of backline items and justify and make it work because what really mattered was your frontline items. It actually has inverted for 6 Vanguard and 2 Marksman. Now, before, it used to kind of be like Leona needed to have 3 true tank items, but because 6 Marksman just gives so much HP, Leona can hold Sunfire and Even Shroud, and it's not that big of a deal to not have true tank items. But as a result, your backline items are much more emphasized. So you really want Rageblade and Kraken on Aphelios. If you don't have that, your 2 Marksman is going to perform significantly worse. And then the third item, ideally, is Gunblade, but you can do a bunch of different other items as well. Same thing with Xayah. She really wants to have strong crit-based AD items. If you're putting, random shenanigans on her like Rageblade and Shojin, it's just not going to do nearly as much damage as those burst items. Golden Ox Graves got nerfed, but it's still really strong in the meta. They nerfed Derek's Gauge, but they didn't really nerf Graves himself. And I think we've optimized him a little bit further. We figured out how to position him. You can see right now we have sort of a Red Sea positioning, just all things on column A and all things on column D. The reason for this positioning is because the enemy tanks will be naturally more drawn in towards the center here and attack Jarvan and Rost. And by doing so, they get pulled away from the center. And what ends up happening is Graves flips over to the other side, kills the enemy tank on this side, and because there's nobody in this area anymore, he's sort of forced to kind of go to the top corner and try to eliminate the enemy carry. And so this is the position that people are defaulting to now. And if you need to adjust because your opponents are adjusting, then you work off of that. The other main thing is that Graves has been revitalized by a bunch of different artifacts. Before, we kind of thought that it was Titanic Hydra and Suspicious Trenchcoat, but two other fantastic one is Wits End and Mittens. Wits End works really well with Graves' passive. You see his passive attacks 5 projectiles in a cone. That actually triggers Wits End 5 times. So it ends up being really, really powerful for him, and then he ends up healing a bunch. You basically have Wits End replace Bloodthirster. Bloodthirster is a replaceable item in all these artifacts set up. You go Titanic, Gauge plus Silver. You go Wits End, Gauge plus Silver, and you go Mittens, Gauge, and Silver. Don't replace items 2 and 3. Take away Bloodthirster, and then either use some other augments to get Omnivamp, like Health is Wealth, or Vampiric Vitality, or you try to just make sure you rush down your opponent as fast as can, and maybe you build something like Gunblade later on. This composition can be pretty tricky if you've never played it before, so just to go over the general game plan, you start off with early Graves, ideally with half of a Stairs Gauge of some kind. You build an early Stairs Gauge on Graves 1. You don't really want to level until 2-5, because then you level twice to get your first Golden Ox activation, and then you double level 2-5 at 2-5. Then, before your level 6 roll down, it's very common to pre-level 12 before your level 6. So that way, you get 2 more EXP, and then you start rolling on 3-2 with Graves 1 on your board, and you spend that turn rolling for Graves 2 to get the Golden Ox procs. And then every turn from there, you're going to roll to try and get Graves and Jarvan, unless you're too poor. I would say that you pretty much want to activate Golden Ox on every single turn you possibly can, if you can make 20 to 30 gold or more. If you have to go down to 10, it's very dicey because you're just not going to have the econ to do that multiple turns in a row. Just wait a turn or two, econ back up, and start rolling again. The cap of this board is also not necessarily 6 Golden Ox. They did nerf that, so you stay on 4 Golden Ox, and you just play 5 costs. In the ideal world, Alistar gets replaced by Viego, Ross gets replaced by something like, Kabuko or Zac, and then you tag in Garen, Golden Ox mods, the whole shebang. Just a cap with a really high 5 cost, and Graves doesn't have to do it by himself, because Graves is going to fall off late game. He's actually not that problematic to deal with if you position around him and you put a big tank in front of him. To counter Graves, just put a giant thick tank, basically how you would counter Sejuani. So if you put it 2 hexes away, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and just put like a giant tank, Graves just gets dealt with pretty easily. So you don't have to actually worry about it too much. But if you are playing the Graves, you really need that duo carry. So set up your second Golden Ox duo, whether it's a Felix or Annie, or get to those 5 costs. Kog'Maw Vanguards is probably the best reroll comp around Vanguards. Vanguards' patch is bananas, and Kog'Maw best abuses it. Plus, they also buff Skarner 3, so that's always nice. Although he's not actually the star Vanguard of the show. It's usually Vi in the early game. Vi does so much damage and tank, and you can even itemize her as like an AD carry sort of. If you get like Stairs Gauge, you can just put that on Vi, and it's nice because you don't really want any of those items on Kog'Maw. Speaking of Kog'Maw, best in slot is Rageblade, Kraken's Fury, +1. The best in the stats is a second Kraken's Fury, but you can just justify a bunch of different stuff. Deathblade, Giant Slayer, Striker's Flail, a Gunblade in pinch scenarios. The best situation to start off with Kog'Maw is a 2-1 augment that scales it or helps you hit really fast. I really love No Scout, No Pivot or Investment Strategy. These are 2 really solid ones to get Kog'Maw rolling. And then you also have econ augments like Starry Night and Pandora's Bench to help you get going as well. Don't feel like you have to go for every 3-star. I think that's one thing about this composition that people might be mistaken on. You don't actually have to go for Kog'Maw 3, Vi 3, and Silas 3, and Kindred 3, and then Skarner 3. Your bench can't hold all those units. So the priority, in my opinion, is Kog'Maw, then Vi, then Skarner. And then if you can get Silas, great. And then the extra luxury on top, like, one of those things where if you just happen to hit it, Ross 3 and Kindred 3 is good. Which might bring you to the conclusion of, do I even need to have Kindred on my board in late game? Absolutely not. You can ditch it for a Zeri 2 or a Draven and just get any rapid fire that you find better. In fact, I've actually seen people play Twisted Fate 3 and play Twisted Fate 3 holding the AP items. You might notice this composition doesn't do tiers and rod items particularly super well outside of 1 or 2. So you can have Twisted Fate 3 hold all those items. You just tech in a Braum for the Syndicate and, play 3 Syndicate, 6 Vanguard with Kog'Maw duo carry Twisted Fate. It's not even bad. So the composition is really easy. There's a couple of nice extensions of it. You can always just tag in Garen for the high cap, just tag in Garen for Vanguard mod. If not, you can also just play Urgot. There's nothing wrong with that, especially if you get a Boombot in late game. It's pretty solid stuff. Very solid reroll comp. Doesn't win many lobbies, but the AVP is very high. So highly recommend this patch. Dynamo Flex is still a thing, and this is pretty much the only AP line you can play if you don't have the ability to go for a fast 9 amp situation. This is pretty much just played if you can get Elise out of an orb and just play the usual like Dynamo tempo, Morgana 2 plus Elise early game with any front line, Bruisers, Bastions, Vanguards, whatever, and then just get to 8, get Misfortune. And the nice thing is Misfortune is less contested this patch because a lot of people aren't playing around this Dynamo line as much, or Syndicate. And you should be able to push to 9 and get to the 5 cost. The composition just doesn't want to play on 8, though. That's the big drawback of Dynamo. We actually see a lot of people at the pro level play Dynamo as if it's another AP Fast 9 comp. Like, they'll take forward thinking, they'll play level up, they'll take slam in, they'll take any econ augments and maybe double econ and try to get to 9 and find Zach. It's a little bit all-in-y, but I mean, that's just kind of the state of where AP is. It feels like level 8 doesn't have a lot of reliable options to play AP, and you have to be thinking about level 9 if you can, which might make you draw the conclusion that Dynamo Flex is for AP high rollers, and you're not wrong, but that is sort of where the position that we're at with this composition. The stats are good because if you play all these 5 costs and you get to 9, of course the AVP is going to be good, but it's a lot harder to pull off than it looks. Don't try to get baited by rolling for at least 3 on 7 or 8. If you are stuck on level 8, you're probably going to lose the game. So at least 3 is one of those things that you get while just collecting it over time. Don't try to stay on a lower level for at least 3. The exception might be if you hit something like Rigged Shop, but even then, if you go for Rigged Shop, then you have to play like the Braum Elise variation, and that one's a lot weaker in my opinion. But if you do get stuff like Memory Bank and the other really powerful augments, you know, things like Cloning Facility for Aurora is fantastic. If you can get that set up, really good stuff overall for Dynamo Flex and definitely worth thinking about. Anima Squad is still a really solid composition to play. It actually has pretty high win potential because they buffed Aurora the previous patch and they generally kept everything really strong. The thing about Anima is just that Leona is harder to get now, so it loses a little bit of placement just because of how contested it is. But it's still really solid, and if you find a way to play a strong early tempo game, I think Anima is just as high of a win rate as some of the Cat Vanguard Marksman stuff, and it's just really good. It hasn't really changed very much. You still really want the combat augments, like Support Spire, Little Buddies, things like Quality over Quantity is really good as well. Climb the Ladder, anything that just helps you with their verticals. One innovation that we found out is that Aurora pulling in the Anima Squad 2-star units actually count towards the weapons. So what some people started to do is if they find Aurora and they're struggling a little bit on gold, they will hold extra things like an additional Silas 2. So that way, when Aurora pulls the Silas 2 in, it's adding another 2-star unit that, one, has synergy with the board. He gets like the active traits and the armor and magic resistance, but you also get a little bit stronger of a weapon. So we've seen people do something like, you know, Cloning Facility, Aurora, double Aurora, have Aurora pull like a Seraphine 2, another Silas 2 in or something. And the benefit is sometimes you even get to hold that while trying to play for like 10 Anima Squad. Because sometimes you hit like Yumi and Vayne 2 and you have to choose one or the other. You can keep one on the bench and have Aurora pull it in for some extra Anima stacks. But anyways, that's like a small innovation. You know, at this point of the set, we're just kind of doing tiny optimizations across the board to improve things. Don't really have anything else outside of that. So just play Anima pretty standard and straight up otherwise. This patch, most Cypher builds have consolidated to just play 5 Cypher. Now 5 Cypher has become a vertical. You don't really want to play 3 or 4. 5 Cypher just gives so many stats that now you just want to itemize all the Cypher units. I will say that this composition is probably the only 3-cost reroll in the meta, which is you really need to hit Draven 3 and Galio 3. In fact, probably putting Zed as the portrait of this is misleading. It might make you think that Zed is the primary target for all the itemizations. It's really about Draven and Galio. And then if you have leftover items, you just give it to whoever you can have high impact. So if you have a Zeri 2 and Renekton 1, itemize the Zeri 2. If you have Leblanc 3 as well as part of your cash out, itemize Leblanc. Maybe you get that Vi 4 cash out, itemize Vi 4. Just whoever has like the most likely to have high impact, just put items on them and cash out. Loot streak every round. Try to cash out with at least 2 lives. The usual loot streak shenanigans. And yeah, just always try to play 5 Cypher if you can, because it's really good. Last but not least, in the A tier, we have Mundo Techies Reroll, aka Gorilla. The only thing that's mainly changed this patch about this composition is that I think you want Bramble Vest now. Otherwise, pretty much just played standard, straightforward. Have Seraphine or Zyra hold items early, get brand 2. When you get brand 2, transfer items over, then have Seraphine hold utility. Pretty much the straightforward standard stuff. Don't try to play this composition unless you have the items early. I think the mistake that a lot of people make is that they have Mundo 2 and they have a belt. And so they pick something like, replication. And if they don't hit belt, they still play it anyways. Like, you really need the item count to get Mundo early. Also, some scaling, the no scout, no pivot investment strategy is good, but you kind of need to have ability to get to 3 item Mundo as soon as possible, because 1.5 item Mundo for stage 2 and stage 3 won't cut it at all. B tier doesn't have that many compositions I'm super excited about, but I do want to shout out a few. The first is that Twisted Fate did get buffed this patch. 5 Syndicate got stronger. Misfortune is better without Dynamo. They reduced her mana count, so she can be a little bit more reliable. Darius got buffed, so he's better early game as well. So just a small, a couple touches here and there ends up making Twisted Fate more reliable. So if you do have a spot to try to play Twisted Fate, you can. Still has the same kind of problems as before, but now some people just might be taking more Broms if they're just playing 6 Vanguards and they just tag in the Brom anyways. So you do struggle with that a little bit, but it's kind of nice that Misfortune is less contested, so you should be able to at least hit that. Nothing has really functionally changed about itemization. If you get Flicker Blade, Twisted Fate, that's also a very good artifact for him. So Flicker Blade is just, the best artifact to open up a 2-1 because you can play 4 costs with it. You can play Reroll with Kog'Maw. You can play it with Twisted Fate. You have many different options there. Leblanc Reroll is probably the most underrated reroll. You definitely don't need Mana Zane to make it work. And you do play the 5 Cypher core, but you play a little bit different because since you want to activate Strategist with Yuumi, you have an excuse to activate the Vanguard and Bastion through Leona and Alawi, and also get Anima Squad online. The old build made you believe that Mana Zane was really important, but you can just get it done with Jewel Gauntlet because Cypher gives so much AP now. So LeBlanc has more than a death cap already attached onto her. Just go for something like Blue Buff Shojin and then go Gunblade and Jewel Gauntlet and just watch her clean up everything. Pretty much the same idea as the 5 Cypher, just itemize whoever you're able to get online. I do think that this is really important to hit Galio 3 as well. So if you do see another Cypher player that's trying to cash out, instead of going for LeBlanc reroll, maybe try to think about AMP instead or something else. But if you do find an opportunity to get to Galio 3, it is very solid. So definitely give it a go. There's a new variation of Urgot making its way around. I saw this in a Chinese tournament, and there might be some legs to it, which is you want to go for Vanguard Urgot. 6 Vanguard is super good. Why wouldn't it be also a good front line to play for Urgot? And essentially, it's just replacing 6 Vanguard 2 Marksman with 5 costs and just playing high value. So this is definitely another way you can play Fast 9 if you have AD. And this is also an alternative because sometimes you're going to be rolling for the Aphelios and the Xayah. You don't hit the Aphelios Xayah. You have Urgot pair. One of those situations, maybe you hit Urgot 2-8 and you're like, is this a high roll? I can't tell. Yes, play 6 Vanguard Urgot with Garen and Aurora and Zach and just the usual stuff and just watch it do a lot of work. So definitely give this a shot. The big contrast to this Urgot Boombot Vex variation that we used to have is that this composition that you see, the Boombot, feels like 3 times more expensive than this one. It feels like all you really need is 6 Vanguard and Urgot and maybe 1 Garen, because that Garen can just, work on mods even if you don't have him 2-star. This composition feels like it needs everything to be 2-starred and more, and you still might not win against some of the other cat board states. So that's what I really like about this Vanguard Urgot. It's just so cheap relative for a Fast 9 comp, and you should be able to get some good results with it. One thing worth noting is that Rageblade is not that good on Urgot, but it is part of your early game because Kog'Maw helps you Fast 9 if you can win streak. And so that's one thing that I want to shout out is that, yes, we have Rageblade on Urgot, but we know it's not best in slot. It's just pragmatically speaking, in order to get into the line, you want to slam this Rageblade and try to tempo as hard as you can, and then you need to move the items off of Kog'Maw onto Urgot. In the late situation in the game, you can move this Rageblade onto someone else, put it on any other dual carry, and go for something better, maybe Giant Slayer or Striker's Flail or whatever. But I wanted to make this clear that Rageblade is only here because it helps us get to level 9, not because it's actually that good on Urgot. You also might notice that we don't have Vex or an Executioner here, and that is intentional. It's because Vex and Execution doesn't offer enough. It's definitely something you can splash in, but it's not that good. So we wrote it down here. You can play Urgot Vex and 6 Vanguard, but you don't actually have to have it. I want to give a shout out to Slayer Vayne Reroll. We do have it in C tier, but I think out of all the C tier comps, this composition has the most potential to move up. Some people do play it. YBY from Vietnam plays it from time to time if he has a spot for it. The build that you usually go for is if you have ideally Flicker Blade, but if you don't, you go double Rage Blade and try to stack more attack speed. That might look weird because then they change Rage Blade to not stack onto each other, but the data suggests that double Rage Blade is still good. I personally haven't tried it very much because I feel like this composition really depends on hitting things like Jarvan and Senna, and that's really hard to do when there's a lot of Graves players in the lobby. But if you get to this board, I've seen it do okay, so it definitely has potential for Vayne and Slayers to make a comeback. Shaco Reroll is probably around B tier right now. A lot of people like playing Shaco Reroll with artifacts, but people just play it for top 4 if you get a lot of Shacos and you can just like kind of bully the early game. It's basically like another Kog'Maw, but less consistent, where you win early game and you just fall off late. So Shaco is definitely a playable composition in the current meta. It's kind of tucked away in here on a situational tier because we have like the best version of Shaco listed as like an S tier composition here with scope weapons. But if you just play like the melee version of Shaco, it's still pretty solid. So speaking of Slayers, just want to kind of highlight that Shaco is a playable 1 cost, really good with artifacts, and probably just like another thing to think about, only if you can hit Shaco 3 pretty quickly. I will say that I think hyper rolling on Shaco 3 has become the norm. Like people are more than willing to roll to 0 on 3-1 to get Shaco 3. Try not to slow roll too much above 50 gold. In fact, I'm probably going to take this out of the guide because I think that might give people the wrong idea. Like, oh, maybe I should consider slow rolling. I think for the most part, you shouldn't be playing Shaco unless you're, 1, very likely to hit by early stage 3, and 2, you're willing to send to 0 because the board doesn't cap very high. It doesn't really do much in the late game. So you don't really need nearly that much gold. You just need to get that Shaco online early, bullying, and grabbing those stacks. I think most people know that Street Demon is not very reliable. It's just brand does not keep up with the current pace of damage, can't really deal with 6 Vanguard, and has a lot of bad matchups. But I wanted to highlight that I think A-Techies has also some potential in this meta, and I do think that they buffed A-Techies enough for it to be relevant. So give A-Techies a try if you ever have a reason to play it. Like you have a techie emblem of some kind for free, whether it's off a Wandering Trainer or you just get it off of, you know, some kind of encounter somehow, or like a Toma traits. I do think a techie is actually quite good. It's one of those things where all of them will just chip in a lot of damage. Like I have like a Veigar 2 no items, Zyra 2 no items, and a Fiddlesticks no items, all deal 2 damage each. And that just adds up over time, right? Because that just like together wipes out a big part of enemy front lines and back lines. So don't sleep on 8 techies in particular. I think this composition has a lot of potential. Nothing really functionally changes about the itemization on brand. You do want techie on Kabuko, and Kabuko ends up holding like these utility and tank items only because you don't have enough items for Kabuko. But in the ideal world, you actually give him similar items to Viego, like Hodge and Deathcap and, you know, Edge of Night, things like that. You tend to struggle a lot with frontline in this composition, so that's another thing to think about. But if you can find a way to get there, I have gotten a lot of firsts with this composition on the patch and ends up being pretty reliable. I want to give a shout out to the Rost hero augment. I do think that Rost is now at a power level equal to Wolf Unchained, Silas, Cease Synthesis, Vibe, Button Mash, Poppy. These are all A tier, very solid stuff. But the problem with Rost is that, man, every board just wants to play Rost. You're talking about the 6 Vanguard boards like Kog'Maw Reroll and want to play Marksman, they play Rost. You're talking about Graves Reroll, plays a lot of Rost in it because they're playing Divinicore. You're talking about the Slayers compositions that play a random Rost. Obviously, anyone that's playing Vertical Divinicore ends up playing Rost. You'd be just really surprised how often you scout around the lobby and everyone just has like a Rost just because it's good for Divinicore splashing and Vanguards. So very hard to hit. If you can hit, actually quite amazing. But I have to recommend against trying to pick this augment because even though it's really good, you're probably not going to hit. I was co-streaming a tournament game with Emily Wang, and she picked this hero augment, and she didn't hit more than 4 Rost the entire game. She looked around, and there was something like 12 Rost gone in the middle of stage 3. There was 0% chance that she would be able to hit unless she had something stupid like 200 gold. So it's just one of these compositions that you can get only once in a blue moon. If you do get it, it's good, but you're very unlikely to. A couple of other shout outs that I want to give that you might be seeing. Rapid Fire Renekton is weaker. I think this composition, even though it's in A tier here, I personally rate it at B tier. It's kind of similar to Rost. I think it's just harder to hit. Zeri and Exotech is just more contested than ever before, so you're unlikely to get to Zeri 2. And one of the actual keys to this composition was stabilizing around 6 rapid fire before you got the Renekton. You would play like Zed or Aphelios on the rapid fire emblem and then play Zeri 2, Draven 2. That's so much harder to hit this patch. So I personally think that this comp is less reliable, but the power level ceiling of this composition is still really high. So a lot of people still like it. So I would just proceed with caution. I do think this composition is quite good at top end, but you kind of need to hit Zeri 2 as a high roll, and you kind of need to find a way to get the Renekton 2, because I've seen a lot of times this composition fizzle out, especially if you play it from Cypher behind. You just might lose that extra life or 2 and take a nasty bot 4, and you would have actually won out if you got like 1 or 2 extra rounds. I've seen it happen too many times. So that's the basic rundown of the meta. A lot of reroll, a lot of AD, not a lot of AP. I'm a little bit sad because I do think this patch is a step back from the previous 2 patches, which I thought were pretty good balance-wise, but just needed a couple tweaks. And now it feels like we are very much driven into the vertical meta. But hey, I mean, set 14 is almost over, and it's not like the meta's in a terrible spot. I just think it could be a lot better going into the regionals and world championship patch. It's crazy to think about, but we only have like 1 or 2 more videos before we start talking about set 15. This is pretty much the end of set 14, and I think I want to do like a full-on video of my thoughts on the set, and maybe do that as like a full-fledged video either for this channel or my highlights channel, which you can definitely go check. I have another YouTube channel that I do a bunch of different like stream content of like highlights and react and doing patch rundown, stuff like that. So I'm more than happy to give my thoughts over there if you're more interested in subscribing to that channel. Outside of that, if you have any more questions about the tier list, check out tftacademy.com, because we didn't cover everything, but I tried to cover what was the most important aspects of the meta, and if I didn't mention it, it probably means you shouldn't be looking to play it very much. That's it for me. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time.